Hello viewers and students, this is Dr. Kashinath Neharkar and I welcome you in my YouTube channel Law Education Volunteer Dr. K.S. Neharkar. Friends, in this lecture we are going to discuss the scope, object and scheme of Transfer of Property Act. Friends, in previous lectures we have discussed what is concept of property, and this act is enacted to regulate the relationship between property and the person who is called as holder or the owner. And in this lecture we are going to discuss what is the reason why the act is enacted, what are the object for which the act is enacted, and what is the scheme of the act. Friends, we know the property right, it is very important right of human being. This right includes a bundle of rights, that is right of ownership, right of possession, right of enjoyment, right to exclude other from making any unlawful interference, and most important right that is available to owner is a right to transfer the property, right to dispose the property, and it includes the right to transfer the property by way of sale, lease, mortgage, exchange, gift, etc. Therefore, the property rights includes right to transfer. But in this transaction, transfer of property is nothing but one kind of transaction where the property gets transferred from one person to another person. It means the ownership of that property is transferred from one person to another person. In certain circumstances, one of the right may be transferred. For example, in case of mortgage, security right is transferred. In case of lease, right of enjoyment or possession is transferred. So friends, therefore the transfer of property is nothing but the transaction by which property is transferred from one person to another person, and such transaction must be very clear, it must be fair, and it should be effected by parties voluntarily. There should not be any kind of undue influence, fraud, etc. So in short, such transaction must be completed smoothly, voluntarily, and without keeping any chance for future dispute. This is very important because nowadays you can see most of disputes that are caused due to the property rights, etc. As you know, wealth is very important cause of dispute. Therefore, it should be regulated property. Even the transfer of wealth, transfer of property, that should be regulated, and that transfer or there should be at least mechanism to regulate the transfer transaction and to ensure the transfer in a such a way by which there should not be any future dispute because of such transfer. Therefore, it requires socially accepted mechanism to transfer the property. So the mechanism, what mechanism, that should be provided by society, and that should be acceptable to society itself. And that is the reason why it is the responsibility of government of any state to provide the mechanism, to provide the rules, regulation, to regulate the relation between owner and property, and to regulate the act by which property is going to be transferred from one person to another person. So that is the reason why the act was enacted. So the property was transferred. We must see what was the position before the enactment of Transfer of Property Act in India. because this act is enacted in 1882. So though we are not going to discuss that in detail, but we are just going to discuss some keys. Like, before the enactment of act, the property was transferred through customs and personal laws. It means the law relating to transfer of property before enactment of transfer of property act was customary law or the personal laws. So at that time the disputes were solved by punch system existent at that time, also called as a panchayats also, and the rules to settle the dispute were decided by the panchas, etc. So this was continued till the Britishers came into India. Even in certain states the rules were made by kings. Even in certain places the religious laws were regulating how the property should be transferred from one person to another person. So, but the problems were increased during British period. When Britishers came into India, then problems relating to transfer of property, etc., that were increased. So therefore at that time the courts in presidency followed English rules to solve the disputes relating to property and transfer of property. These principles are like equity, justice, good conscience, or apart from what the English principles that were followed in Britain or British courts. But these principles were only followed in a presidency towns like Madras, Kolkata, Bombay, etc. In the rest of India at that time, the courts used to follow the personal laws, customary laws to decide the dispute. Therefore, this created confusion due to the contradictory decisions by court on the same issue. Whether these decisions were given by courts in a presidency towns or courts outside the presidency towns, they gave the different judgments on the same issue, same dispute, and therefore there was no uniformity in rules of transfer and dispute settlement also. So it created need to provide codified law to regulate property, to regulate transfer of property. And at that time the Britishers started to make the laws, to provide laws for India. So under that regime period, the British government felt that there is need of codified law relating to transfer of property. So therefore the government took place for the enactment of act, and this is the enactment of Transfer of Property Act. Friends, therefore to provide a specific law on transfer of property, the British government appointed law commission in England, in Britain, to prepare substantive law of transfer of property for India. The commission was consisted of Lord Romilly, Sir Edward Ryan, who was Chief Justice of Bengal at that time, then Lord Sherbrooke, Sir Robert Lowe, and Sir John MacLeod, who was assisted by Lord Macaulay. Lord Macaulay, who is known for drafting IPCLs. Friends, the commission drafted a bill, and that bill was sent to India in 1971 for its passing, but the bill was introduced into council at that time and it was failed. Then again the bill was redrafted, published, and public opinions were called. The bill was severely criticized. So many suggestions, recommendations were received from public, and therefore again the bill was referred to commission consisting of Charles Turner, who was Chief Justice of Madras at that time, then Raymond West and Whitley. Then the bill was redrafted by such commission and it was sent to council for passing. And finally, on 17 February 1882, the bill was passed in the form of Transfer of Property Act 1882. This is the act which is currently applicable to whole of India with certain modifications. Even after the independence, this law was continued for its application for independent India. Friends, we must know what are the objects for which the act is enacted. The basic object of Transfer of Property Act is to codify law on transfer of property. Codified law was not there. What the existent or the prevalent act before the prevalent laws before the enactment of Transfer Property Act, that were either customary or religious laws, personal laws. So there was no codification. Now with this enactment, the codification of transfer of property law is made. Then another object of this act is to enact rule to regulate transaction of transfer of property between living persons in harmony, by which there shall not be any future disputes due to that transfer. The next object is to complement law relating to contract transactions regarding immovable property. See, the Contract Act is enacted in 1872. That was enacted in 1872. So after the enactment of that act, the transactions of transfer of immovable property that were completed through the written contracts, but the law of contract was not complete act to deal with the transfer of immovable properties. Therefore it was necessary to complete what the requirement of law of contract for the transfer of property in a finality. Then another object of Transfer of Property Act is to bring uniformity in transaction of transfer of property throughout India. So before the enactment, the transfers were governed by personal laws, Muslim personal law, Hindu personal law, Christian personal law, even there were some other community rules regulation. There were the customary laws also. But now with this enactment, all transfer transactions of immovable property with certain exceptions that should be completed, that should be effected only as per the provisions of act. So to bring uniformity, the act is enacted. Now friends, we must see what is the scope of act, to which the act is applicable, to which kind of transaction the act is applicable, which transactions are exempted, that we must know. Say firstly, the act is applicable to all of India. Then it is applicable to transfer of property by act of parties. Say act of parties, it is nothing but the voluntary act by party. So the act is applicable to only those transactions which results out of desire of parties, act of parties. An act should be voluntary always. Then this deals with the transfer of transaction between living persons only, interviews. So the transfer of property transaction, what the transactions that are regulated by Transfer of Property Act, the transaction must be in between living person. The living person means the natural persons as well as the artificial persons that are recognized by legal system. Then the act is applicable to transfer of both movable and immovable properties. Through this act, movable property also can be transferred, immovable property also can be transferred. Then this act does not affects the Mohammedan personal laws. Mohammedan personal laws, the act gives exemption to transfer of property by Mohammedan personal laws. Then the act is not applicable to those transactions or those transfers that are caused due to insolvency, due to succession, due to execution of decree or the operation of law, because the nature of such act is that it is not voluntary act, because the transfer of property act is applicable to voluntary act of transfer of property between living person. Therefore, and lastly, for in regard to dispute settlement, the courts can apply English principles. So this is the scope of act, friends. Now we must see what is the scope of transfer of property act. Friends, as you know, this act is applicable to transfer of property, or transfer of property is nothing but an act. So the property can be transferred by two ways. One is by act of parties, which is always the voluntary act, and secondly by operation of law. The transfer of property act is not applicable to those transfers that are caused due to the operation of law. Friends, it means the act is applicable to all those transfers which are caused by act of parties. Then again, the act of parties can be categorized in two categories. Act of parties, the property which is transferred only because of the desire of that person, and this is the transfer through testamentary documents, which is not regulated by this act. Those transfer which are the testamentary, that are not regulated by this act. And second is the transfer which is called as a transfer of property in between living person, and that is called as the transfer interviewers. Transfer of property in between two living persons. Then the this act is applicable to transfer of movable properties as well as immovable property. Therefore, firstly, the transfer of first part, right from section 5 to 37 and section 122 to 129, that are applicable to transfer of property, whether it is movable as well as immovable. And second part is which consists of section 5 to 37 as well as section 38 to 137. These are exclusively applicable to transfer of immovable property. Friends, again this section 38 to 137, that are applicable to transfer of immovable property. Among these, section 54 to 137, that are specifically applicable to transfer of immovable property by way of various specific modes, and these specific modes are like sale. First, you can't see this because the image is larger than what the size of this PPT. Therefore, I am facing some difficulties to show this. But the first kind of transaction that is regulated by transfer of property is the sale. Then second is the mortgage. Then third is lease. Fourth is exchange, and fifth is gift. So, and all these transactions are covered by section 54 upwards. So friends, this is how we have discussed what is the scope, object and scheme of transfer of property. So friends, you must remember the transfer of property is nothing but the act between two parties to transfer the property, and basic object of transfer of property act is to provide rules, regulation, mechanism for transfer of property in a smooth manner, in a smooth way, or to provide the process to transfer the property smoothly without keeping any chance for future dispute. So friends, if you liked my video, please like it, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe my channel, and also don't forget to press bell icon to receive notification relating to next video lectures. Friends, thank you.